Okay, so I want to now look a little bit at Du Bois and the notion of what he termed, you know, the racial problem. And then I want to think about how we can apply our sociological imagination from, this period, from where we are now. Okay, so when Du Bois looked at the issue of race, he coined a term in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. He coined this term called double consciousness. And in double consciousness, he was talking about the way in which being an African American man and an American created this tension because he felt that, from being African American, from his culture, there was a lot to offer the world, but that often wasn't accepted by broader America, and that in fact there were structures in place that really were an impediment to the achievement of equality, and more to the point, actively sought for African American peoples to experience disadvantage. And so he says he simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. Now, you might remember in the other module that I'd put the term primitive in inverted commas. Another way that we can indicate that this is a word that is being used as a quote and that we recognize that it's not a word that we would use is the use of putting sic, S-I-C, in brackets. So you'll sometimes see that, for instance, when people are quoting something, that has been said which is racist. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that will come up in your literature if you're reading about race. Okay, and I also want to note that this was the terminology that was being used in 1903. And when, for instance, Du Bois was writing in the 1950s or 60s, his language had changed with that. Okay, so Du Bois also talked about the notion of being a problem. So Du Bois also wrote, to the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. And yet, being a problem is a strange experience. So, one of the things, that we'll often find is that if someone has an identity which is marginal or oppressed, that is often perceived in mainstream society through our media, through our institutions like churches or schools or our workplaces. Those identities can be seen to be a problem. So you might want to think about whether you or someone you know experiences that particular issue. How does it play out? Not just, I guess, in interpersonal relations, but how does it play out institutionally in things that happen to make their lives difficult because of that concept of it being a problem. And I've included a link to an elder who very much rejects the idea that she is the problem. And I think it's well worth watching. It's a very eloquent explanation of her identity. But when we look at things sociologically, we don't look at individuals as the problem. We look at those kinds of broader issues as the problem. So the problem is not someone of a particular or racial ethnic group. The problem is the construction of race and racism. Okay? We don't look at someone who is female as a problem. what we look at is the construction of gender and the experience of sexism as the problem. Okay, so we do that using our sociological imagination. Okay, so what happens with a sociological imagination? Well, we know that there are four different features. There's the historical, the structural, the cultural, and the critical perspective. Okay, so if you like, that's our box. That's the different elements that we're going to think about. But the way in which we, I guess, fill that box with what sort of things we can filter could be like our own lived experience, so the common sense understandings, so that's things that we might hear at home, that we might hear, someone say in a conversation in a coffee shop or a pub, what are called, I guess, common sense wisdoms, which are often really not based very well in fact. We might put in things like popular culture, so movies and shows that we watch, or magazines that we read. Even meme culture, could be part of that. We can think about media, whether or not we watch the news and documentaries. What kind of slant or bias does a particular media outlet or publication have? We can think about academic texts, things which have been peer reviewed, like journal articles or book chapters. We can apply a different theoretical lens. We might also, come from or be in touch with a culture that has an oral history. So we might get some of our information there. It could be creative arts, so dance or music. And, other forms of community documentation, like community histories or community gardens, things like statues in a park. What kinds of things do these tell us about particular issues in society? Now, when I approach the sociological imagination, and I guess I want to put an Indigenous lens on it, I use this term called Kooriness. And that was a term coined by Professor Bob Morgan, who's the chair of the Board of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Education and Research here at the University of Newcastle. And for Bob, that was about Aboriginal people, or, in some places in New South Wales, Kooris. That was about Kooris having a connection to their own histories and cultures and ancestral wisdom, being proud of that, and bringing that to, I guess, a lens on how to look at the world. So you might have another kind of lens that you would put as your basis. But you do have to acknowledge that it's there, that there are things in our own experience that influence how we look at these things. So I could give, each of the members of your tutorial the same book, piece of art, movie, song, anything that comes from those different areas. I could give that all to you, and you would all come up with what would at the very least be slightly different, but in some cases greatly different analyses. And it doesn't mean that you're necessarily right or wrong. It's about how you argue that, how you bring that critique to your analysis. So when I want to look at, my Indigenous sociological imagination, one of the things that I think is really important is to amplify Indigenous voices. Okay, so one of the things that we'll find, of course, is that all of those textbooks on Aboriginal people from the founding fathers and, that time period, say before the 1900s, they are exclusively written by non-Aboriginal people. what we'll find, even today, that there's quite often panels on TV shows that are comprised of non-Indigenous people talking about what is best for solving Indigenous issues. So I think that part of what is important in an Indigenous sociological imagination is to try to bring some balance and let Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices be heard as well. Okay, so an Indigenous sociology, also suggests that, we need to think about the ownership of those particular ideas. Okay, so if there is cultural knowledge, that actually belongs with the cultural knowledge holders. Okay, and also that Indigenous peoples should, where possible, be cited directly, not as secondary sources. Okay, so if you're doing an assignment on Aboriginal people and there's a non-Indigenous author and they're quoting Aboriginal people, it can be really useful to go back to the source and see whether that interpretation around the quote was in fact what the person meant. And one of the things that we can also look at is the way in which sometimes there are representations which are very well-meaning and are meant to be positive, but in fact reinforce stereotypes. And I've put here an example of a Teach Queensland ad, which was to encourage people to become teachers in the in the public education system. And so there's a picture there of a teacher. I've blanked out people's faces. That wasn't in the original ad. Okay. A teacher surrounded by some young male Aboriginal dancers, and it says, "I always had a soft spot for the troublemakers, the misunderstood, the kid that everyone thought wouldn't make it." Now, one of those young boy dancers is the son of an Aboriginal academic, Dr. Chelsea Watego. And Chelsea, on seeing this ad, because the parents were not asked for permission to use their child's image in the ad, said that what that did was it unconsciously reinforced the bias that Aboriginal kids are the troublemakers, the misunderstood, and the person or the child that people think won't make it. And so that ad was withdrawn. And so we need to be really careful about how we use visual imagery to support what it is we're trying to say. Looking at the example then to the right is a screenshot of an online game set in Australia where, one of the problems that you had to overcome was being attacked by Aboriginal people. But in fact, they used the term Aborigines, which is a term that, was used historically, but which we wouldn't use today. So there are a whole range of ways in which people choose to take on Indigenous imagery, Indigenous iconography, and use that in ways that are, really not acceptable. And so that, I think, is part of evaluating the sources that we have, that we're putting in that Indigenous imagination. Okay, so now let's look at a couple of different types of representation. So these are ones which have either been done by Aboriginal people or in consultation with Aboriginal people. So carry a safe mob, not a big mob. keep our mob safe, stop the spread. We see there the use of the Aboriginal English, the use of mob for family or community. We see the use of Indigenous icons. Okay, we see pictures that are chosen that have Aboriginal faces. These are all part of making sure that when we present information, that it's accessible to all people and all people see themselves reflected in that information. And then we can see an idea like one mob, that all Aboriginal people are one mob. Now, that's true for some people, but some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people instead see themselves as part of specific nations rather than part of a broader group. Some people might say, well, I have this identity which is place-based, but in a political sense, I see myself as part of a broader Australian group. So when you use terminology and when you take a position, you can acknowledge that there's a diversity of ways that people express that identity and, try and articulate why you've made your particular choice. Use references, use quotes. Don't just take a position as if this is what all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people think.